just a wonderful evening. But the idea, I still think this is what the Oscar is, just a...
On May 20th, 1997, James Stewart turned 89 years old inside a quiet house on Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills, a house he had shared for decades with a wife who was no longer there to celebrate it with him. He would live only 6 more weeks. There was no press conference that day, no grand television interview, no dramatic on-camera confession. And yet, if you spend enough time inside the biographies, the letters, the archival interviews, and the recollections of the people who actually sat across from him in those final years, a strikingly consistent picture comes into focus. A short list of men whose friendship and example shaped Stewart more deeply than any award ever could. This is not a story about box office numbers or Oscar statuettes. It is a story pieced together from decades of documented record, from Scott Eyman's acclaimed biography Hank and Jim, from Marc Eliot's Jimmy Stewart, a biography, from NPR, Turner Classic Movies, and the trivia and production notes preserved by film historians. It is the story of the 5 men James Stewart trusted most. By the time he reached his final year, Stewart had already outlived nearly everyone who defined that era with him. He had given up flying, given up the long solitary walks he once took around his neighborhood, and given up largely on public appearances. What he had not given up was the habit, noted by several of his biographers, of talking about the same handful of men whenever old friends or family asked him about his life in pictures. Not the directors. Not the studio executives. Not even, most of the time, his leading ladies. The men he returned to, again and again, across interviews stretching back decades, were fellow actors who had stood beside him off the set as much as on it. Piecing together those interviews alongside the documented record of who actually showed up for Stewart, and who he showed up for in return, produces a list that is remarkably stable no matter which source you consult. Start with the one everybody expects, because the expectation is earned. Henry Fonda and James Stewart met in 1932 as members of a small Massachusetts theater troupe called the University Players, 2 broke young stage actors who ended up rooming together that summer and then again when the company moved to New York for a production called Cary Nation. According to Turner Classic Movies' own account of their history, neither man had any inkling of what was coming. When Stewart parlayed his stage work into a contract with MGM and followed Fonda out to Hollywood in 1935, the 2 roomed together yet again, this time in a house famous enough that, according to interviews collected for Hank and Jim, their neighbor Greta Garbo built a wall to keep them out of her yard, and the 2 grown men reportedly tried digging underneath it. It is a small, almost childish detail, but it says something true about who they were to each other before fame ever entered the picture. Biographer Scott Eyman, who interviewed Fonda's widow and children along with 3 of Stewart's own children for his book, described their eventual dynamic in Hollywood as an odd couple, noting that if Stewart was a curious puppy, Fonda was more like a cat, standoffish, particular, content in his own company. Their differences ran deeper than personality. Fonda was a lifelong liberal Democrat married 5 times. Stewart was a conservative Republican who remained married to one woman, Gloria Hattrick McLean, from 1949 until her death in 1994. By most accounts, the 2 men clashed hard enough over politics at least once that they agreed to simply stop discussing it, a truce that held for the rest of their lives. Both volunteered for military service in World War II and were decorated for it. And when Fonda died in 1982, Stewart carried the loss with him quietly. Journalist and filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich, who knew both men, later recalled that whenever the subject of their friendship came up, Fonda would simply say they had learned long ago not to talk about politics at all. After Fonda's death, while filming a scene for the 1983 television movie Right of Way, Stewart reportedly looked upward and said only 2 words, "Thanks, Hank." 50 years of friendship distilled into that. The second name belongs to Gary Cooper, and the record of their bond is written in one of the more quietly devastating moments in Academy Awards history. Cooper had already won his first Best Actor Oscar for Sergeant York in 1942, an award Stewart himself presented to him. 20 years later, in 1961, Cooper was set to receive an honorary Academy Award for his body of work. He could not attend the ceremony. According to reporting from that period and later retrospectives, the industry understood privately what the public did not yet know. Cooper was gravely ill with a cancer that would kill him within days of the broadcast. It was Stewart who stood up and accepted the honorary Oscar on his friend's behalf, reading a brief statement to a room that, by several accounts, sensed something was deeply wrong even as they didn't yet have the full story. Life magazine, in coverage from that era, described Stewart as one of Cooper's closest friends in the industry. Cooper died less than 2 weeks later. There was no ceremony for that kind of loss, only the memory of one friend standing in for another when he no longer could stand for himself. The third man could not have been more different on screen from Stewart, and that contrast is exactly what made their partnership so enduring. John Wayne and James Stewart first worked together in 1962 on John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, playing a rancher and a lawyer whose fictional friendship became one of the most quietly moving depictions of loyalty in the Western genre. They reunited that same year in the sprawling ensemble picture How the West Was Won, and then again in 1976 for The Shootist, which turned out to be Wayne's final film. Stewart played the aging doctor who treats Wayne's dying gunfighter, a role that carried an unmistakable weight given what audiences now know about Wayne's own declining health at the time. Off-screen, their bond outlasted the cameras. A personal letter Stewart wrote to Wayne on his own stationery, believed to have been sent around Wayne's birthday in May of 1979 while Wayne was hospitalized following stomach cancer surgery, has survived and been auctioned as a piece of Hollywood memorabilia. In it, according to the letter's documented content, Stewart called Wayne the biggest star in the world, and said that in his lifetime, Wayne had stamped America across the face of the motion picture industry. Wayne died roughly 2 weeks after receiving it. Politically, the two men stood on similar ground as outspoken conservatives in an industry that leaned the other way, but what the record actually shows is less about ideology and more about two working actors who respected each other's discipline and simply refused to let go of the friendship, even as one of them was dying. The fourth name is Cary Grant, and their connection is inseparable from one of the strangest Oscar wins in Hollywood history. In 1940, the three of them, Grant, Katharine Hepburn and Stewart, starred together in The Philadelphia Story, directed by George Cukor. Stewart played Mike Connor, a magazine reporter, a supporting role by any honest measure next to Grant's leading man and Hepburn's star turn. Yet it was Stewart, not Grant, who walked away with the Best Actor Oscar that year. Stewart himself never fully believed he deserved it. According to production trivia and interviews preserved by film historians, he told people for years afterward that he had actually cast his own vote for Henry Fonda, who was nominated that year for The Grapes of Wrath, and he described his Philadelphia Story win as, in his own words, deferred payment for my work on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The film that had been the heavy favorite the previous year and lost. It is a rare thing for an actor to publicly undercut his own Oscar, and it says something about the kind of respect Stewart held for the men working beside him, Grant included. Off-screen, the two moved in overlapping circles for decades, appearing together at industry events and functions well into their later years, two of the industry's most private men, oddly matched in their mutual discomfort with the machinery of fame. The fifth relationship is less romanticized than the others but no less real, and it belongs to Ronald Reagan. Long before Reagan was a politician, he was a working actor and eventually president of the Screen Actors Guild, moving in the same conservative Hollywood circles as Stewart through the 1950s and 1960s. The friendship became public knowledge largely because of one now famous line, attributed to Warner Brothers studio chief Jack Warner, who reportedly balked when he heard Reagan wanted to run for governor of California, insisting that if anyone from Hollywood belonged in office, it should have been Jimmy Stewart for president, Ronald Reagan for best friend. Stewart, who had retired from active military duty as a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve, the highest rank ever held by a Hollywood actor, became one of Reagan's steady supporters through his political campaigns and, according to accounts from those years, was a frequent visitor to the Reagan White House. When Reagan won the presidency, Stewart is documented as telling him he could not express how happy he was to finally call him his commander-in-chief. It was a friendship built less on movie sets and more on shared conviction. Unlike the others on this list, Reagan and Stewart rarely shared a screen together, and their bond drew skepticism from some of Stewart's own circle, including friends who felt it was built more on ideology than intimacy. But the record of visits, letters, and Stewart's own public statements suggests he considered it genuine, and it stood alongside his oldest Hollywood friendships until the end of both men's lives. None of these 5 friendships were built on flattery, publicity, or convenience, and none of them survived simply because the men involved always agreed with one another. Fonda and Stewart voted for different parties for 50 years. Wayne and Stewart carried a friendship through one man's decline that the other could do nothing to stop. Cooper's honor came to Stewart only because Cooper himself was too sick to receive it. Grant shared a screen and an Oscar controversy that Stewart never fully made peace with in his own mind. And Reagan represented a bond built almost entirely outside the industry that made both of them famous. What ties them together is not spectacle or celebrity. It is loyalty measured patiently in decades, shown up for in hospital rooms, written honestly into private letters, and spoken quietly to an empty sky after a friend was already gone. By the time Stewart reached his final months in that house on Roxbury Drive, The films themselves have become almost incidental to the story biographers wanted to tell. What remained, what people who actually knew him kept returning to in interview after interview, was the character of the friendships he built and did not abandon. Frank Capra called him the best actor to ever hit the screen. Kim Novak said he taught her it was possible to remain who you are without being changed by the world around you. Those are the kinds of tributes that outlive box office receipts, and they are, in the end, the truest measure of the five men James Stewart spent his life admiring, not because of what they achieved on screen, but because of who they truly remained once the cameras finally stopped rolling for good.